Welcome to Theological Table Talk, the podcast of the Center for Christian Studies. It's really good to be here today, and I'm joined as usual by Todd Hall, the Associate Director of the Center. Todd, how's it going?
Good. Hey, everybody. Good to
All right.
not see you.
Yes, they're seeing you. We're going to be talking today about congregational singing, and we're really pleased to be joined by a couple of fellows who have thought a lot about this. And so I'm really happy to talk to uh, Greg Straughn and Darryl Tippens today. Let me just briefly introduce each of them. Greg teaches courses in music, history, and theory at Abilene Christian University and has been on faculty there since 2000. He has served in a variety of administrative roles there, including 15 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, but last year just returned to full-time teaching, classroom teaching, which he noted on the note that he sent me is his first love. I don't know. I think most of the time people go into administration, it's not because it's something they dreamed of doing. So I'm glad you got to return to classroom teaching. Um, and then notes that his research interests are 19th century opera, American gospel music, and contemporary choral music. I think also, perhaps, Greg is a song leader at his local congregation, if I understand that correctly. Okay, so Greg, really happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Happy to be back in the classroom. That's for sure. But happy to be here.
No doubt, no doubt. And then we're joined also by Darryl Tippens, who is professor emeritus at Abilene Christian University and provost emeritus at Pepperdine University. There's a lot to say about Darryl, but just in our context today, we'll say that much of his scholarly work has focused on the intersection of Christianity and spirituality and literature. And then, particularly, he has an interest in the role of corporate singing in spiritual formation and communal cohesion. He was an organizer along with Lincoln Hanks um, at Pepperdine University of a conference called The Ascending Voice, an international symposium of sacred a cappella music. So Darryl has had a long interest in congregational singing, and particularly a cappella singing. And he notes also to me that his one of his most recent publications is an article in the Journal of Christian Studies. So our listeners may recall that our first issue from 2024 was on the theology and practice of singing. Darryl's article in that is called "The Church Born in Song Towards a Sacramental Theology of Congregational Singing." A wonderful article in a wonderful issue. So I will plug there that our listeners should know that when you subscribe to the Journal of Christian Studies, you get digital access to all of our back issues and archives, so including that issue, of course. But Darryl, thank you so much for joining us today.
A great topic, and I am happy to be included.
Yeah, so let's just get right into it. We've done a couple of podcasts recently, episodes on some aspects of congregational singing, and particularly just, what are some good songs we talked about generally, and also more specifically about kind of the pros and cons of congregations projecting songs on slides. We took up quite a bit of time talking about that. But in this episode and with you guys, I'd kind of like to just back up a little bit, maybe zoom out a bit, and just ask, what is, in your judgment, the current state of congregational singing? Overall, would you say, is it better off or worse off than it was say 25 years ago, around the turn of the century. And maybe it's a mixture of both. But in what ways are we better off, or in what ways are we worse off when it comes to congregational singing?
Who wants to start here? Wow.
Man, whoever wants to go can start off.
Let me start by saying it is a safe thing to say it's different. Now, whether you want to say it's
Mhm.
better or worse, we are not where churches were in the 1940s or the 50s or even the 60s. A number of factors are causing change, and I think isolating or identifying some of those factors would be very helpful. I also want to say if you move beyond just churches of Christ to Christian churches in America today, you will discover concerns about the decline, the apparent decline of congregational singing is not unique to churches of Christ, is not unique to a cappella churches. I know people in the Catholic tradition, in the Methodist tradition, in the Presbyterian tradition, who are actively working to try to encourage congregational singing. So it is not unique to us, whatever we're dealing with here.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And thank you for clarifying just that it is different. Let's talk about what those differences are, and then we can give an evaluative judgment of whether it's better or worse. But definitely different. Yes.
I think I would add I, that over the last quarter century or so, I feel like congregational singing has become more a performative experience, where there is a little bit more focus on either the worship leader or maybe the praise team, or if you want to expand that out just a little bit further, maybe the praise band, such that the congregants in congregational singing are taking less of an active role, more of a passive role. And so it becomes a more performative experience. To me, that seems to be the one of the bigger indicators there, as Darryl was noting, over the last quarter century. And I would say that maybe the previous 50 years before that, it was a much more dialogic experience. And if there was a solo or something like that involved, it was at a smaller scale, and there was a greater sense of activity that's involved in the production of music in a congregational setting. Again, not restricting it to churches of Christ, but rather just in general.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good observation. So, and that covers a lot of that's an umbrella in some ways for some of those more specific differences that we see is the performative aspect of it. Um, what else?
It's interesting because that also, I think, is a social trend, not just even in churches, but people are no longer really producers of music. We're consumers. You go back to the 19th century or 18th century, and if you wanted music, you had to make your own.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's interesting that it's following along that trend. We also, even in churches now, becoming consumers rather than, producers and that sort of thing.
Well, and that's a great point. If you didn't make it yourself, it didn't exist. You had the sheet music on the piano, and mother or grandmother or somebody would be sitting at the keyboard playing popular songs or hymns or whatever it would be. I think, though, that the performative nature of congregational singing is also indicative of just our 21st century sensibility of always being performative, whether that's in a social media context or putting on your best face for, well, a podcast or
Thank
or a
you for
sermon,
dressing up. Yes.
or a sermon, right? I mean, I think we have seen the shift away from maybe the heavier theologically informed sermons to those that are much more psychologically palliative, and that's not necessarily going to produce, 80-year-old faithful Christians at the end of, the 21st century. So
Good. Other thoughts, maybe lining out some of these differences that
One thing I want to sort of think through with you, and maybe or even have an argument with myself, is around the question of whether was there once a golden age when we did it so well and so right, and if we could only return to the golden age. Now, I can argue either side of that because I remember the golden age when I was young and going off to college at a Christian college, and the evenings when we had devotions under the stars, and how glorious that was. And I remember chapel services where there was this rich and robust singing. And I grew up in a church that had rich and robust singing. But however, the other side of it for me is some of our very language about how we describe our worship places is, for me, a giveaway. In most churches I've ever been a part of, you assemble in the auditorium. And an auditorium is a place where you go to sit in rows to hear a lecture or some kind of presentation. And in the church I grew up in, the main event was a long sermon. Now, what was the saving grace for me growing up loving singing was we did have a so-called song service where there was rather robust participation. But there was still no mistake about it. It was an auditorium. And in a sense, what we have shifted for those churches that are becoming more, let us say, progressive and experimental, they've simply moved from the auditorium model to the performance hall model. But it's still about the people, the folk, being primarily passive to receive something from the stage that is lit and amplified. And to me, that is not necessarily an improvement, but it's simply a variation on this theme of whether or not worship is the worship of the people, or is it the practice and the exercise of the professionals. In other words, even in a very low church model, you have a clergy laity distinction, a kind of de facto clergy laity distinction.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we had some robust singing in the past, and I want us to do everything we can to make it a bigger deal today than it perhaps is. But I don't want to camp too much about on the theme of how good it used to be in the old days.
Well, it sounds like you're saying the singing itself was the golden part of that golden age. The language, the way we in Churches of Christ talked about worship, what was the central act of worship, which was different from that of the historic church, where Eucharist was the central act of worship, and it was more participatory. All of that, yeah, may not have been quite as golden, but whatever it was conducive, more conducive to singing, less performative, as you say. I think we've gone from, sanctuary was out. We've gone from auditorium to, as you say, performance hall or theater.
Yeah, a very good point. And for me, the thing is, the shadow over so many churches in the Stone Campbell movement, the shadow over us is the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment models for how to understand our religious experience. And so it becomes primarily religion from the neck up. And so a really good service is the one when the preacher knocked the ball out of the park because it was so stirring. But for me, the one exception was our singing wasn't just from the head up. You can't sing and not use your body. In other words, we had a kind of disembodied religious experience, except when it came to singing, and then we finally could open up and move. Uh, and I'll never forget an African American gentleman in my church years ago who said to me after church one Sunday, he said, "You know, Darryl, when we start singing these songs, my leg starts moving. And is that okay?"
Yes.
And I said, "Yes, it is. It really is. And if our legs didn't move, at least we could tap our feet or
Yes.
we could sway a little bit." And we allowed our children to use their bodies. We would sing songs like God Made the Big Round Sun, and we performed the song with our bodies. It wasn't a performance up front on the stage. It was a performance of the whole body of the church. And that's something we need to get back to. And it's not just because we're nostalgic about it, it's actually the way God created us. We are embodied beings.
Yeah.
And worship is intended to be a full-bodied, a whole body experience.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's a wonderful point. I want to echo what Darryl just said and maybe reflect a story that still stays with me from about 20 years ago when I attended up in Grand Rapids at Calvin, at that time Calvin College, their symposium on worship and the arts, and was introduced to a very simple song that had some hand movements. It was about 8 measures long, and each 2 measures had a different hand movement. Take me as I am, make me new. And we learned those little hand movements along with this song, and we sang it in a repetitive fashion, adding an additional hand movement every time we repeated that. And then we took away the song and left the hand movements, so that after 8 iterations of the song, the entire room was in silence,
Mm.
and the hand movements were going on in the tempo of the song, and everyone was hearing the song in their head, but there was no sound that was going on. So that embodiment of singing doesn't necessarily have to be loud or amplified or with a drum or with a keyboard or anything like that. It can be very intimate and yet still expressive. And I think maybe that's one of the concerns that I have about churches, especially churches of Christ that have embraced instrumental music. Personally, I don't have a theological concern about ways of embracing instrumental music, but I fear that embracing instrumental music is automatically associated with I need to have a drum set, a guitar, an electronic keyboard, maybe some bongos, so that I have a very homogeneous and very flexible set of instruments that are used to create this sound world that is very familiar to us. Because anytime you turn on the radio or hit Spotify, you're getting that kind of sound world. So it's very pop oriented. That's fine, and there is a place for that. But it's also nice that our a cappella traditions in the churches of Christ have allowed us to embrace a different sound world than what we normally experience in the rest of the world. And that sets what we have done on Sunday mornings apart. And I think that's a wonderful aspect of growing up in an a cappella tradition where it was necessary to have, as Darryl was describing, robust singing. You needed to have people who would sing the alto part or the tenor part to accompany that melody. And that the beauty of that also being the metaphor for everybody being involved is something that just it lifts me up in moments of despair and weakness and sadness. So I appreciate that about our own tradition.
Yeah. When a cappella churches talk about and bringing in an instrumental service or instrumental worship, they're not talking about a pipe organ or a piano. They're talking about the full, more or less, rock band. And I'm hearing in all of this, we were sort of hitting on that difference where worship, and particularly the singing part, has become more, as Darryl said at the beginning, performative. And an evaluation was not given to it, but I think I can say that this has been a negative shift. It was, as I think was said, in auditorium setting, everything else was pretty passive in churches of Christ, except for the singing service. And to the degree that we value in worship congregational participation, we have taken away in this shift the one thing that was left for congregational participation. Because, as was already said, the sermon was a passive thing. You didn't even need people out there for that. Um, I think of COVID when we had in some places preachers preaching to an empty audience with maybe names or cardboard people, in the pews. You don't need people for
Yeah.
preaching to, technically. The Lord's Supper, we don't even get up for it. We just sit there on our rear ends while it's passed to us. It's all so very passive. But the singing was the one thing that everyone was invited to participate in. And I just think almost invariably, there may be exceptions to this, but when the instrumentation that you just described, Greg, is brought in, uh, it discourages um, that universal participation. It is by its very nature professionalized and performative.
Well, and it also centers on one aspect of the music making, and that's the melody. And that's a very, very important aspect. I love teaching sight reading to incoming freshmen or freshman music majors, new students, because that's the foundation. It is musical literacy. Can you open up a piece of music, look at it? We like to sometimes say, hear it with your eyes and sing it with your ears. Can you do that in a literate kind of fashion? And there is literacy in churches where you learned to read music, at least on a maybe a relative level. I know the notes up at the top are higher than the notes at the bottom. Sometimes that's just enough. But when you're only doing that with one melody voice and everything else is supported by other instruments, it definitely reduces that amount of literacy. And I think um, it narrows the scope of what is going on when we talk about singing together, making melody in our hearts, right? I mean, it's not just that single melody. I think it is the whole, the harmonic, the rhythmic, the timbral, the visceral kinds of connections that get made when multiple people are singing together. Now, you can sing, and I have heard wonderful experiences of worship services. You can sing multiple parts with instruments present as well. That is very possible, but that's intentional, and that really takes um, um, a thinking about both planning and executing worship that is sometimes lacking. I think it's easier to kind of hit the easy button and say, all right, I'll sing the melody and we'll have the keyboards play the harmony and the drums will give us a beat and the bass will give us a bass and away we go. So it takes some intentionality, it takes some real creative thinking to say, can we involve instruments and still have multiple parts present? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes. Just takes some practice and some intent.
One of the things I think we need to talk about is remedy here. What can be done where we are today. I want to affirm and argue that uh, human beings love music universally, and they love music making, and in the right setting, they love to sing themselves. You don't have to argue with children to get them to sing. It's just natural to them. What I see is perhaps missing, and I don't know enough about every uh, church in town or across the country, but I don't see a lot of evidence of the training of children through years of experience of singing and group singing. That's one thing I did have, and it was partly because it was built into the whole culture. We had singing in the classroom at the public schools. We had choir practice and we had special groups of singing, and we sang in my home. You know, my mom loved singing, and then youth group. We would have on many Sunday nights in youth group, the entire youth group evening would be spent just singing. And then after an hour of singing, then we went to Sunday night church,
Mm.
sang. And I don't think that's the world that young people live in today. And meanwhile, they've got their ears on where all through the week they're hearing highly professional, highly produced music. And it's like Nola Cantandre. I can't compete with this. That's why people today say I can't sing. It's because they don't sound like Justin Bieber, you know, or
With the
someone
auto
like Nick
tuner.
Young. And so I think churches have to become much more intentional about this. It's interesting to me that there are churches now that have Bible bowls where they really pride themselves on teaching their children to compete on biblical knowledge. Or now there are even national competitions for preaching for kids. I would ask the question, what's the parallel for singing in churches of Christ, where it should be a ubiquitous practice all the way through life, you know, as they grow up in the church. That to me is what's missing, that there's a failure to even understand that there's a theological issue at here. You know, that there's a theology of music in Scripture, a theology of singing that's profound. And many people have said this over the years. You know, Charles Wesley said that, the hymnal was practical divinity for him. And Kathleen Norris talks about this a lot in her wonderful book, The Cloister Walk, you know, where she said music for her was serious theology. Music as theology, not let's get the singing out of the way so that we can get the theology from the pulpit. But the theology is coming all the time if we have the right repertoire in our singing. So to me, you're building belief into the person, into the body of the person when you're singing the faith. Nora says at one point in her book, she says, I never believe so much as when I'm actually singing
Mhm.
the text. It's in the singing of the text that her faith is deepest. And I would say that's probably true for me.
Yeah, I like that. So the remedy, and thanks for kind of moving us on to, okay, what can we do about this? I think you're right. The remedy is always, for any lack, is training the next generation, those who will succeed us. And I think, yeah, you bring up a really good point there about uh, how are we doing that? In LTC, Leadership Training for Christ, it's been a while since I've been involved in that, but they had a song leading um, aspect to that, and there was, competitions and song leading. And there was I think, yeah, there's a choir also. Churches could, youth could have a choir. So there are some aspects to the musical side of that. But we've lost with the more performative aspect, with projecting songs often without notes. We've lost that inductive training that all of us here, I think, grew up with. You didn't have to have a separate, time to learn music. All you had to do is sort of pay attention and look at the hymnal and see when, the melody went up or down or whatever, and start learning, especially if you had shaped notes, start learning kind of intuitively what that triangle means, you return to that. So we've lost a lot of that inductive training that was baked into the system as well. Other thoughts on just what can be done about this?
One of the things that comes to mind as I kind of think about both that inductive training and that kind of intentionality is allowing allowing some conversation about what do we want to sing, what are our, and not necessarily just letting the song leader pick out, 7 random songs for Sunday. So my dad was the song leader at our church, and I remember, coming up with the little numbers and getting to put the numbers up in the little slots on Sunday morning at 8:51 or something like that. And to Darryl's point a moment ago about the golden age, yes, our singing was robust. I don't know how intentional it was, but it was robust, and partly because there was one songbook. It did have a second 728, but it was only 800 or so songs, and of those 800 or so songs, we probably sang 520 of them, right?
Wow, that many. I'm impressed.
Well, yeah, that's not.
Yeah.
I think that's probably right in the middle of the bell curve of average. Over the span of 15 years or so, right? I don't mean every year, but that's 10 songs every Sunday, and if you sang different ones, over 10 years you'd sing 520 songs. So I think that asking for input in building repertoire is a path toward remedy, because that involves involvement. It involves some sense of stakeholding, of claiming some responsibility in shaping a worship service. So at our church, we have a little worship committee that has bounded together over the last couple of years, and we don't turn anybody away. And every so often, everybody kind of looks around and says, "Do you still want to continue doing this? And if not, step off." And we continually invite people to participate. And the result of that is it's not just one person's responsibility to pick the songs for any given Sunday. And so that kind of division of labor has also lessened the kind of toil of picking the songs out. I've done that for years, and it gets old. It's hard to be creative and thoughtful about that. And it's easy to kind of just go back and sing one of the 50 or so songs that I really like to sing. And that's not necessarily what others need to hear. So I like the involvement of others. We have expanded that out and asked the youth group to organize a Sunday, asked the college class to organize a Sunday. And we haven't always been successful in following through and executing all of that. But the dialogue has been really helpful, because it's also allowed us to see some blind spots of, hey, we're not singing this particular song, and that's something that a whole chunk of people really like, and we need to be more intentional about that. It also has the opposite benefit of saying, hey, this particular song, which is associated with whatever reading we were going to do that Sunday, this particular song has, let's go through the text and read the poem and see what is it about the lyric that is particularly appropriate for this particular Sunday. And that kind of unpacking the meaning of what we're singing has, I think, shed a little bit of a different light on the usual and customary process of, I like these songs. We need a song before communion. Well, we've just read about turning water into wine. Then let's sing "Would You Be Poured Out Like Wine" on the altar, right? So being able to knit some ideas together in a service has been a really beautiful and special and meaningful way for us to kind of reclaim what it is we're doing when we sing together.
I think about the church I grew up in, where I spent basically the first 18 years of my life there, and I cannot remember a single sermon from those 18 years. Now, I'm sure, in fact, I was informed by many of the concepts that flowed from the pulpit. So I want to give the ministers credit. They were really good men, and I was formed by them, I'm sure. But what I can say is I remember song after song after song that I sang in those 18 years. So those songs are indelibly impressed on my heart, right? Um, and I would say that if church leaders, ministers and church leaders understood how formative music can be, they would give as much thought to that as they would how do we hire the best preacher when it's time to find a new preacher. Think of all the efforts a church will go through to find the right preacher, but they give almost no thought to how their church may be formed by the rest of the liturgy. So I would include also the scriptures that are read and the prayers that are prayed. In other words, all of that is forming the person in the pew, not just the sermon. Um, there's the old Socratic line, to know that you don't know is the beginning of wisdom. And I think what pretty close to breaks my heart is the sheer lack of knowledge of hymnody that's possible that churches know nothing about. Our churches are, in fact, deeply siloed. And that's true even of the ones that get the latest song off of the contemporary Christian music station that's playing during the week. They think that because they've broken out of the hymnal and they can now do a song that they got off of the Christian radio station, that they are really with it. And they know nothing about the explosion of hymnody worldwide. And I'm not saying that's true of all churches, but I'm saying the ones I know are just oblivious to what's possible. And it really came home to me when we did our Ascending Voice Symposia, because by bringing Mennonites together with Eastern Orthodox and conservative Presbyterians, it was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that there were such beautiful, simple melodies that are very singable, that can be done with or without accompaniment, but they can be sung simply. A friend of mine just took a group of students to Taize, France, and he came home and told me how they were blown away by young people, and it was young people, not old gray-haired people like me, young people from all over the world gathering at Taize and singing in French and in Latin and in German and not so much in English, but Taize songs are simple and easily accessible. And I think of the music that's coming out of the Iona community, in Scotland, and the work of John Bell. And these hymns, songs are so singable. And that would be so natural in a community. I don't know if you know the song called "The Summons." I will come and follow me. Jesus is speaking to us. Come and follow me. It's called "The Summons." It is so beautiful, so simply accessible, and it's like, why that's not a part of the repertoire of Churches of Christ? It makes no sense to me at all. And so there we go.
I'll just plug John Bell here that Darryl was mentioning. There's One Among Us, a little songbook. See how thin it is, right? I mean, it's only 70 pages long. And then Taize has several different, this is Songs and Prayers from Taize, several different little simple books that have about, 40 to 50 songs in it. And these are 8 measures, 10 measures long, right? They're basically a chorus, and they are one line. There are no multiple verses, maybe 2 verses at the most. And they're designed to be repeated again and again. They're wonderful for communion. I love singing them at communion time because sometimes you need to vamp in communion anyway. If it's taking along, especially if the back of the auditorium is more full than the front of the auditorium, you might, and I've done this plenty of times, start the song and realized, oh, we're going to run out of the song before we've continued passing the tray. So those songs that repeat, there's a pragmatic benefit of those. But also, that's a wonderful time to slide something in that might not be as well known because it's quiet anyway, and it's totally fine for people to use the communion moment to think and to be quiet and not necessarily participate. So I think there is an opportunity at that particular moment in our own fellowship, because we do weekly communion, to involve something that might be not quite as regular and familiar, because it can be kind of a reflective moment. To add one other sort of element to this, I think there is an importance, and Darryl, you mentioned singing in other languages. I think there's a real opportunity to sing in Spanish. We have a Spanish congregation that is part of the church, and once a quarter or so, we all meet together. Otherwise, we're in different rooms of the building. And when we meet together, we are very intentional about singing in Spanish, singing songs that we already know. Holy, 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 santo, 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 right? Singing everything that you know already, just dealing with Spanish lyrics is very approachable. That is something that many congregations can do. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do all 6 verses of Just As I Am in Spanish. Maybe you do the first verse in English and the second verse in Spanish, or the first verse again in Spanish, right? You've done the first verse twice. Things like that, I think, are really, really helpful for making something old new again, right? To kind of reverse the old quote there. And one other layer of that is wonderful is to find poems, texts that fit the metrical pattern of an old familiar hymn tune. And to that end, I just can't sing the praises of hymnary.org. Hymnary, HYMNARY.org, that again is coming out of Calvin College, Calvin University. So our Reformed brethren are doing the Lord's work there in supporting congregational worship. But hymnary is wonderful because you can sit down and look at, hey, I have the sermon, in a couple of weeks is going to be Jesus walking on the water. Okay, right. So what are the immediate songs that come to mind when you hear that the story of Galilee? Well, some might, but popping that scripture into their little scripture finder and it pops up 87 different hymn tunes or hymns that have that kind of topic. And even if you don't know that, what you can do is look at the number of syllables in the line and say, I can find a song. Most of our songs of faith and praise, songs of the church have an index that shows you the number of syllables in the line. And you can take an old song, an old tune, God moves in a mysterious way, and put new words to that old tune. And it is not difficult. And that might be a place where you can project those new words. And because the tune is fairly well known, Amazing Grace, or All People That on Earth Do Dwell, the doxology, right? Those tunes are fairly well known. And you can make something new out of something that was old. We've done that many, many times. And occasionally I'll get somebody who says, I didn't know that song. And I said, but you knew the melody of it, I bet. And begrudgingly I will get, well, yeah, it sounded familiar. And so it lessens the anxiety of doing something new in that context. I love doing that. I do it all the time. It does take a little bit of work, but I think that's part of the intentionality that we were talking about earlier. That is a path forward to strengthening congregational singing, being mindful of it, and preparing for the worship service with that in mind.
No.
wonderful point, and I just want to salute it. Ezra Pound, the great American poet, said, "Make it new." And by making it new, he didn't mean throw out tradition, but it's about refreshing the tradition and renewing the tradition and helping you see the old tradition in a new light. That's what a good sermon does every Sunday with the text. There's nothing older than the Bible. But the preaching that sticks with you is when the preacher helps you see it in a new way or hear it with a fresh new sense of understanding or nuance. So, and there's so many ways to do this. Before our time is up, I do want to beat the drum on one point here, if I may be instrumental in my
Yes,
thought
please.
thinking. I was reading some Wendell Berry poems earlier this week, and this particular book is called Another Day, Sabbath poems. And I came across a poem that begins looking at screens, and he probably has this in mind, but we all spend so many hours looking at screens. And he says, looking at screens, we pass into the age of disembodiment. Screens and disembodiment. Since singing is fundamentally about something you do with your body, I want to argue that screens encourage disembodiment. I'm not opposed to using them. We're using one right now as I speak. But I noticed this one Sunday years ago when I was worshiping at the University Church in Malibu. One Sunday, the projection machinery had a glitch and it broke down. And we started singing this song, I'll Fly Away. And all of a sudden, with a blank screen, I noticed the strangest thing. The volume and the energy of the worshiping community rose. And it was like the best I'd ever heard without a screen. Because, A, most people kind of knew the music anyway. And they took their eyes away from this wall, which they look at like zombies, and they start noticing that there's a body of people around them. I'm telling you that screens unintentionally are suppressing body life. They encourage disembodiment. I noticed it when I was teaching English in college because I loved showing films to my students, but I also noticed that students in front of a screen in a dark room started going passive. It's like they were mentally kicking their shoes off and having popcorn, and they had become more or less inert. Rather than being actively engaged, they were receiving it passively, just like I might watch a Netflix movie at night, mentally all relaxed. And I think something similar is happening in music. A few years ago, I saw this happening in a congregation, and I told the minister, I said, with all of the amplification up front, and with the fact that they have this new music that we've never seen, and we have no musical notation in our hands, and the lights are all on them, and we've dimmed all the lights in the auditorium. I'm just looking around and I'm noticing people are not singing. And I said, let me make a deal with you. You choose any people you want and ask them to come sit near me next Sunday and report back to you whether people are singing or not. Well, he didn't take me up on it, but there's something about a screen that works negatively on you. I'm not offering hymnals. I know that you can have your face buried in a hymnal. I can think of many times song leaders would chastise the church for having their faces buried in a hymnal. But I'll tell you this, a hymnal is still tactile. And there's something about a piece of paper or a book in your hand that is different than staring at an electronic screen. So I'll quit my railing, but I would say, try this sometime. take a song that people know already, or they can have in a different form and turn the screen off and see what happens.
I think that's a very good point. It reminds me of Charles Taylor's the word excarnation is sort of that disembodiment that screens do contribute to that. It also, and here I would refer listeners back to the episodes where we talked a lot about this very point and how screens, especially in a worship assembly, uh, can reduce participation and all the sort of pros, but I think mostly contras for projecting songs. It strikes me also as just in your comment there, but also previous comments that I think it's good to, as y'all said, refresh, renew, and all of that. For a lot of our congregations, simply pulling out a hymn book and singing 6 verses of Just As I Am without
Mhm.
other contemporary songs shoved between the verses um, will be a new experience
Yeah.
to reflect on, just to take that example, the beautiful poetry in those words. So in some ways, the old itself, even without sort of refreshing it, the old in and of itself will be a
Yeah.
new enough experience that it will be fresh and yeah, great.
If it's true that we're getting our theology through our hymns, it seems to me that there's a way in which we could take the text of a really rich hymn and have it delivered orally, as a read text.
Yeah.
Maybe people in the audience actually, each 5 different people read aloud 5 different verses, 5 different lines of the hymn, and then the church sings it together. I know uh, some churches have people stand to sing a hymn, or stand to hear scripture read. How about bringing the gospel down into the congregation and having it read in the middle of the congregation to everyone? Would that cause people to have heart attacks or not? It might. There are various ways in which our bodies can be engaged in worship that are deeply biblical and ancient too, but we just don't do them because we still have the lecture hall history and we just inherited it. And it's not that we are all that committed to it, we just don't know different. And I think it would be great to shake it up a bit.
Those are great ideas. I think I love that just reading and having, maybe various people reading the verses that would bring more attention to the words and the poetic beauty. With some of the contemporary songs, maybe some of the older songs too, that are sung, trying that would really expose how terrible some of the poetry is.
Yes, and that's right. We would be embarrassed if we actually thought about what we're saying.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fair point and one that is worth, but counterbalancing the example there, right? I mean, you have to choose wisely a song, a text that you might read. Just as I am is a good example. God moves in a mysterious way, which I'll put out there as the greatest English hymn of all time. I'm a big William Cooper fan. And not to say that there's a fountain filled with blood is not also a very, very good hymn tune. It is, or
Um,
hymn text. Uh, but I mean, let's take that example. There is a fountain filled with blood flowed from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath the flood lose all their guilty stains. That's an unusual text. Very evocative, very graphic, right? And to say those words out loud
mhm.
and to read, I don't know, there's probably 7, 8, 9 verses of that poem. Maybe you don't read them all. They're not all in the hymn book anyway. But to read that and to just sort of let that sit and then to come and sing that song, That's a great little moment, right? And it takes a little more time. It's not as efficient. Just reminded of Marvadon's title of her book, A Royal Waste of Time, right? The whole idea of what we do together is we royally waste our time together in that worship moment. But it's not necessarily as efficient a process to do that. Singing is not an efficient process. Chanting, the way that Gregorian chant developed, was really to help project the text in a way that you could hear at the back of the monastery or the cathedral or something like that. And so there is a pragmatic element of that, but the beauty of those words and then letting them sort of seep in. So thank you, Darryl, for reminding us about the kind of the mediation that a screen interposes between the worshiper and God. And I think our goal in worship should be to take down as many of those barriers as possible.
A couple of quick things that can also, I think, refresh the singing service. One is to return to the oldest form of worship, of singing worship, where it is in some form or another antiphonal or responsive. So you have a cantor and the congregation, or you have one side of the congregation singing to the other side of the congregation. I've seen Ken Nafziger do this,
Mhm.
the Mennonite who used to teach singing and music at Eastern Mennonite University. And he's brilliant with this, and I've seen him do this in Stafford Chapel, and it just dissolved me in tears. It was so beautiful. And to have one half of the congregation literally turn and face the other half of the congregation, where you're looking in each other's eyes, each other's faces, and then you're singing to one another. And by the way, that's kind of like biblical. Sing psalms and hymns to one another. Uh, and the old preachers who used to line out the hymn, this is an old variation of this. But the idea of the cantor and the congregation, or the lining out of the hymn by a group with the congregation, is very effective. And there's so many variations of it, and how it can be objected to, I don't know, because we have all kinds of hymns where there are female parts and then male parts, right? And we seem to allow that. That is another variation of being antiphonal. And then one other quick thing I'll work in here as our time gets to a close. Just the idea that there are so many verses to great hymns that we never sing. And if you want to make it new, I've just recently made a couple of presentations on Amazing Grace. And the story of those verses that are there and not there is quite interesting. The last verse that we all know, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, was not written by John Newton. It developed in the mid 19th century, and then it got added to the hymnals. But it was a long journey before that last verse got there. Meanwhile, Newton's final two verses, no one ever sings. And in a class I just taught earlier this week, I asked them to read those two last verses and tell me why modern hymnals don't include those hymns, those verses, those stanzas. And it became a great kind of theological conversation. So I can imagine a sermon that developed this story of the evolution of Amazing Grace, which is the most famous hymn in the world by all accounts. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records, by the way, for that reason. And then talking about why it works. How is it possible that Judy Collins could do a solo a cappella version of it, and it became a top 10 pop hit in 1971 in America? When did that ever happen? A solo a cappella hymn becoming a pop tune. It's a great story, and it can make a great service, I think. So encourage you to try it.
Very good. She could do it because she was Judy Collins, personally.
Okay, don't try this at home alone.
Right. Not everybody can do that. Well,
Wrong, Derek.
yeah. Hey, this has been a great conversation, and it's, I think, time to wrap it up. It has been excarnational and disembodied. The screen, for our sake, is a great stopgap. Certainly, it's not as good as being together in person around a table, but it's the next best thing here. And so I want to thank Darryl Tippens and Greg Straughn again for joining us for this episode of Theological Table Talk on really the state of congregational singing. We've had a lot of good ideas and even sort of, I think, suggestions toward improving congregational singing. So I hope that listeners can take some of these things to heart and maybe even put some of these great things into practice. Again, I want to remind folks of the previous episodes that we've done on singing. And again, that Journal of Christian Studies, I think it's volume 4 from 2024 on the theology and practice of singing. I think it will be really helpful for those who are interested in this topic. So we're also going to put in our show notes some of the things that we've referred to in books that were mentioned. But thank you for listening today to Theological Table Talk. We invite listeners to share a comment or a question maybe for us to discuss in the future. If you have suggested topics or guests that you'd like to see, email us at info@christian-studies.org and check out the Center for Christian Studies at christian-studies.org. And if you like what you see on the website, if you like what you've heard today on the podcast, be sure and hit that give button and let us know. But thank you again to our guests today, and thank you all for joining us at the table for Theological Table Talk. Until next time.